October 13th, 1792, 8:47 p.m. The governor's mansion, Charleston, South Carolina. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as Governor William Moultrie raised his wineglass, the burgundy liquid catching the candlelight like liquid garnets. Around him, Charleston's elite, planters, merchants, and politicians, lifted their own glasses in anticipation of the toast that would celebrate another year of prosperity, built upon the backs of human bondage. But in the shadows of the grand dining room, a figure moved with practiced silence. Samuel, his dark hands steady despite the thundering of his heart, adjusted the final silver serving dish on the mahogany sideboard. His eyes, pools of contained fury, swept across the feast. He had spent 3 days preparing under the watchful eye of the kitchen mistress. Roasted duck glazed with honey and herbs, sweet potato pudding seasoned with cinnamon, rice pilaf fragrant with saffron, each dish a masterpiece of culinary art, each dish now carrying the weight of 23 years of accumulated rage. Before we begin tonight's story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories. Turner's voice boomed across the room, rich with the authority of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human souls. Gentlemen, to our continued prosperity and the divine order that blesses our fair state. Samuel's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the serving spoon as he watched the men who had built their fortunes on flesh and suffering prepare to consume what would become their final meal. The irony was not lost on him. The hands that had prepared their food were the same hands that bore the scars of their whips, the same hands that had buried his wife just 3 months prior. Tonight, justice would be served alongside the finest cuisine Charleston had ever tasted, and none of them would live to see the dawn. The making of a revolutionary Samuel had not always harbored murder in his heart. Born on the Ashford plantation 30 miles inland from Charleston, he had learned the brutal mathematics of slavery before he could properly walk, that his worth was measured in pounds of rice harvested, in hours of labor extracted from his growing body, in the number of lashes he could endure without crying out. But Samuel possessed an extraordinary gift for cooking that had manifested itself when he was barely 10 years old. The plantation mistress, Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, had discovered his talent quite by accident when she tasted a simple stew he had prepared for the other enslaved children. Within a month, Samuel found himself transplanted from the rice fields to the plantation kitchen, a move that probably saved his life but condemned his soul to a different kind of torment. Under the tutelage of old Martha, a woman whose culinary wisdom had been passed down through 3 generations of bondage, Samuel learned not just to cook, but to transform simple ingredients into elaborate feasts that would make wealthy planters travel for days just to dine at the Ashford table. He discovered the delicate balance of spices that could elevate common Carolina rice into something approaching transcendence. But with each perfectly prepared meal, with each compliment from white lips that had never acknowledged his humanity, Samuel felt pieces of his soul being carved away like meat from a bone. He was praised for his gifts while being denied the most basic human dignities. It was in the Ashford kitchen that Samuel met Celia. She had arrived on a slave ship from Barbados, purchased specifically for her skills as a seamstress. Celia possessed an elegance that transcended her circumstances, the way she carried herself, the musical quality of her voice when she hummed while working, the gentleness with which she treated the younger enslaved children. Despite the horror that surrounded them, Samuel found in Celia something he had thought lost forever: love. When they were finally allowed to marry, a ceremony that held no legal weight but carried profound meaning within the enslaved community, Samuel thought he had found a reason to endure. For 3 years, love sustained them. Celia's belly grew round with their first child, and Samuel threw himself into his cooking with renewed passion, driven by the need to provide whatever small comforts he could manage within the constraints of their bondage. The breaking point came on a humid August morning in 1789. Celia had been suffering through a difficult pregnancy, weakened by inadequate rations and grueling work expectations that never ceased, even for an expectant mother. On that morning, as Celia struggled to complete her assigned tasks in the sweltering heat of the laundry house, she collapsed. Samuel found her there, unconscious among the steaming tubs and hanging linens, her body burning with fever. He carried her to their cabin and spent the night tending to her, using every remedy Martha had taught him. But when the morning work bell rang and Celia could not rise, Samuel faced an impossible choice. He chose love over duty, remaining by his wife's side as her condition worsened throughout the day. Master Ashford found him there that evening, kneeling beside Celia's pallet, holding her hand as she struggled for each breath. The man who had profited from Samuel's Samuel's talents for nearly a decade, looked down at this scene of human tenderness and saw only defiance. "Boy," Ashford said, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who had never questioned his right to dictate the most intimate details of other people's lives. "You've got explaining to do." Samuel looked up at his master, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not immediately lower his gaze. "She's dying, master. My wife is dying." "Your wife?" Ashford's laugh was a sound like breaking glass. "You don't have a wife, boy. You got a breeding arrangement that exists at my pleasure, and right now you got work needs doing." The whip caught him across the face before he could finish his plea. What followed was the worst beating of Samuel's life. 23 lashes, delivered with methodical precision while Celia watched, too weak to do anything but weep. Each strike was accompanied by a lesson about property and obedience, about the natural order of the world and Samuel's place within it. Celia died 3 hours later, while Samuel lay face down in their cabin, forbidden to seek medical attention until morning. Their unborn child died with her. At the funeral, Samuel stood beside the rough wooden cross that marked his wife's grave and felt the last vestiges of hope drain from his soul like water from a broken vessel. That night, lying alone in the cabin that still smelled of Celia's hair, Samuel made a promise to her memory and to himself. He would survive long enough to make them pay. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 weeks after Celia's funeral, Samuel was sold to Governor William Moultrie's Charleston mansion, Charleston's heart of power. Governor William Moultrie's Charleston mansion was a monument to South Carolina's peculiar prosperity, a 3-story Georgian masterpiece that spoke of wealth built upon the labor of enslaved thousands. Samuel arrived on a crisp October morning in 1789, still bearing barely healed scars from his final beating at the Ashford plantation. The governor's kitchen was a marvel of efficiency, designed to produce elaborate meals for the constant stream of political dinners and social gatherings that defined Charleston's high society. Samuel was placed under the supervision of Aunt Josephine, a woman in her 60s who had been managing the governor's kitchen for nearly 3 decades. Under Josephine's tutelage, Samuel's already considerable skills evolved into something approaching artistry. He learned to prepare elaborate French dishes adapted to Carolina ingredients, discovered the subtle chemistry of wine reduction sauces, mastered the timing required to coordinate 7-course meals, served to 30 guests simultaneously. But, more importantly, he learned to listen. In the governor's kitchen, information flowed as freely as the wine served at the master's table. Samuel learned which merchants were struggling financially, which planters were expanding their operations, which politicians were positioning themselves for higher office. He also learned exactly how the white elite viewed the enslaved population they depended upon for their comfort and prosperity. The problem with the Negroes, he overheard Governor Moultrie explaining to a visitor from Virginia, is that they require constant supervision. Left to their own devices, they revert to their natural indolence. These conversations, conducted mere feet from where Samuel prepared elaborate meals with skills that had taken decades to develop, reinforced his growing understanding of the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Southern society. The same people who dismissed enslaved individuals as naturally inferior relied completely on their labor, their skills, their knowledge, and their loyalty. Samuel's hatred crystallized during his first Christmas in Charleston. The governor hosted an elaborate celebration that lasted 3 days, featuring guests from across the Southeast. Samuel worked 18-hour days preparing feast after feast, his talents pushed to their absolute limits. On Christmas morning, Governor Moultrie presented Samuel with a gift, a new set of kitchen knives, fine German steel that would make his work more efficient. "You're a credit to your people, Samuel," the governor said, his voice warm with what seemed like genuine affection. A perfect example of what can be achieved when natural talents are properly cultivated. As Samuel held the gleaming steel, feeling the perfect balance and razor sharpness, he was struck by a profound realization. He was being praised for his excellence while being denied his humanity, rewarded with tools to better serve the people who owned him like livestock. That night, as he carefully cleaned and stored his new knives, Samuel began to plan his revenge. The art of invisible war revenge, Samuel learned, was not an explosion, but an erosion. It required patience, planning, and above all, invisibility. Over the months following that Christmas revelation, Samuel began to systematically catalog everything he learned about the governor's household, his political connections, and his social obligations. He also began to study poison. The knowledge came from multiple sources, accumulated carefully over many months. Old Martha at the Ashford plantation had taught him which plants and herbs could heal, but healing and harming often differed only in dosage and preparation. During his early morning cleaning duties, he would spend precious minutes studying botanical texts in the governor's library, learning about alkaloids and their effects on the human digestive system. Samuel began cultivating certain plants in a hidden corner of the mansion's extensive gardens, using his knowledge of horticulture to grow specimens that would be impossible to trace. He experimented with extraction methods, testing different techniques for concentrating active compounds while eliminating bitter tastes that might alert his victims. The opportunity he had been waiting for door arrived in the form of an invitation that set Charleston's social circles buzzing. The governor would be hosting a special dinner to honor visiting dignitaries from France. The guest list read like a directory of South Carolina's power elite, plantation owners who controlled hundreds of thousands of acres and tens of thousands of enslaved people, merchants whose ships carried slave-produced goods to markets around the world, politicians whose laws maintained the legal framework that made such wealth possible. Samuel's plan required months of preparation. Each dish would be a masterpiece of culinary art, but selected courses would also serve as delivery systems for carefully chosen toxins. The symptoms would begin subtly, perhaps dismissed initially as overindulgence, but as the evening progressed and the toxins accumulated in their systems, the guests would begin to understand that something was terribly wrong. By then, it would be far too late. The date was set for October 13th, 1792, exactly 3 years to the day after Celia's death. Samuel saw this as more than coincidence. He saw it as providence. The Last Supper. The morning of October 13th dawned crisp and clear. In the governor's kitchen, Samuel began his preparations before sunrise, working by candlelight as he had done countless times before. But today was different. Today, every movement carried the weight of years of planning. The menu Samuel had designed was a masterpiece of culinary sophistication. Turtle soup with sherry, roasted duck with orange glaze, venison medallions in wine reduction, sweet potato soufflé, rice pilaf with saffron and almonds, seasonal vegetables prepared in the French style and European style desserts. Each dish had been chosen with multiple criteria in mind. The turtle soup would be laced with extract from castor beans, a toxin that would cause severe digestive distress within hours, but would initially be indistinguishable from rich food consumed too quickly. The duck glaze contained concentrated alkaloids from carefully cultivated oleander, compounds that would interfere with cardiac function. The venison reduction incorporated derivatives from pokeweed root, substances that would cause respiratory complications as the evening progressed. Samuel had spent months calculating the proper dosages, testing his extraction methods on small animals trapped in the mansion's gardens. He knew exactly how much of each toxin would be required to achieve his desired effects, and he had built in redundancy, even if individual guests avoided certain dishes. The combination of toxins distributed across multiple courses would ensure that everyone who attended would consume a lethal dose. As the sun began to set and the first guests arrived, Samuel made his final preparations. He carefully arranged the poisoned dishes on elaborate silver serving platters, checking and rechecking to ensure that nothing had been overlooked. Each plate was a work of art, but more importantly, each plate was a weapon aimed at the heart of the system that had destroyed his life. At exactly 7 o'clock, Charleston's elite began to file into the governor's dining room. Samuel watched from the kitchen doorway as they took their seats around the massive mahogany table, their faces flushed with wine and self-satisfaction. Governor Moultrie stood at the head of the table, resplendent in his finest evening wear. "Gentlemen," he announced, "tonight we celebrate not only our French allies but the prosperity and stability that make such celebrations possible." Samuel stepped back into the kitchen, his work nearly complete. 3 years ago, he had knelt beside Celia's grave and sworn an oath of vengeance. Tonight he would fulfill that oath in the most complete way possible. He picked up the first serving platter and walked toward the dining room, his footsteps steady and sure. The turtle soup was exquisite, the unfolding catastrophe. The first course proceeded exactly as Samuel had anticipated. The turtle soup drew immediate praise from the assembled guests. Governor Moultrie complimented the preparation personally, noting the subtle complexity of flavors. Around the table, Charleston's elite savored each spoonful while discussing politics and business. Samuel served each bowl with practiced precision, his face maintaining the expected expression of respectful attention, but behind his carefully neutral exterior he was counting, noting who consumed the soup eagerly, calculating the approximate doses of castor bean extract each guest was ingesting. The second course, roasted duck with orange glaze, arrived to even greater acclaim. What the guests could not taste was the concentrated oleander extract that Samuel had incorporated into the glaze, a cardiac toxin that would begin affecting their heart rhythms as it entered their bloodstreams. As the evening progressed, Samuel began to notice subtle changes in his victim's behavior. Senator Richardson excused himself briefly, returning with slightly flushed cheeks. Colonel Manning seemed to be perspiring more than usual, occasionally dabbing at his forehead with his linen napkin. The third course, venison medallions in wine reduction, marked the halfway point of Samuel's carefully orchestrated symphony of death. The pokeweed root derivatives in the sauce would begin affecting respiratory function within 30 minutes. By the fourth course, the first overt symptoms were beginning to manifest. Judge Carlisle complained of stomach discomfort and asked for water. Dr. Matthews mentioned that he was feeling slightly unwell and wondered if something disagreed with with him. Samuel continued serving with imperturbable professionalism, offering appropriately concerned inquiries about the guest's comfort while internally noting the progression of symptoms. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. By the fifth course, several guests were openly displaying signs of serious illness. Senator Richardson had excused himself from the table twice, returning each time looking pale and unsteady. Colonel Manning's breathing had become labored enough that other guests were beginning to notice, and Judge Carlisle was gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles as waves of nausea overcame him. Governor Moultrie, though clearly beginning to feel unwell himself, attempted to maintain the social atmosphere by suggesting that perhaps the evening's wine had been stronger than expected, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Perhaps we should postpone the remaining courses, Dr. Matthews suggested, though his own voice was strained. Several of our party seemed to be experiencing some form of alimentary disturbance, but it was already too late. The toxins were now circulating in lethal concentrations through every bloodstream at the table. It was Judge Carlisle who first spoke the thought forming in all their minds. Through gritted teeth and between waves of agony, he managed to voice the question. We've been poisoned. The words hung in the air like an accusation, transforming the dining room from a scene of illness into a crime scene. Suddenly, every eye turned toward Samuel, the one person who had prepared every dish, who had access to every ingredient, who had served every course with his own hands. Governor Moultrie, despite his deteriorating condition, summoned enough authority to point an accusatory finger toward Samuel. "You," he gasped. "What have you done?" Samuel stood perfectly still for a long moment, meeting the governor's gaze with steady eyes that no longer showed any trace of subservience. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and calm. "I have served you exactly what you deserved," Samuel said simply. The confession transformed the room into chaos. Several guests attempted to rise, but their weakened conditions made movement impossible. Samuel continued speaking, his words falling like hammer blows on the assembled men who had never imagined they could be brought so low by someone they considered property. 3 years ago, you killed my wife, Governor Moultrie. You beat me senseless while she lay dying, then sold me like livestock. Tonight, you learn what justice tastes like. Senator Richardson, despite his agony, managed to spit out a curse. "You savage, we will see you burned alive for this." "No," Samuel replied with quiet certainty. "You won't." He was right. The toxins had progressed beyond any possibility of treatment. Within the next 30 minutes, every man in that room would be dead. Samuel walked slowly around the table, observing his victims with the same clinical detachment they had once shown when inspecting enslaved people for purchase. He paused beside each chair, studying the faces of men who had built fortunes on human misery. "Colonel Manning," Samuel said, stopping beside the slave trader who was now fighting desperately for each breath, "do you remember the Mercy, that ship you brought from Angola last spring with 300 captives? 47 died during the crossing, but you still made a profit." Manning tried to respond but could only produce a gurgling sound as blood began to foam at his lips. Around the table, Charleston's elite were learning what it meant to be powerless, to have their lives placed entirely at someone else's mercy. For the first time in their privileged existence, they were experiencing the terror that had defined every day of Samuel's life since childhood. One by one, the most powerful men in South Carolina succumbed to the toxins Samuel had carefully crafted. Senator Richardson was the first to die, his heart finally failing under the strain. Judge Carlisle followed minutes later. Colonel Manning fought longer than the others, but even he could not overcome the methodical destruction Samuel had orchestrated. By midnight, 12 of the most influential men in the state lay dead around the mahogany table. The elaborate feast Samuel had prepared remained largely untouched, the poisoned dishes now serving as silent testimony to the most audacious act of resistance in the history of American slavery. Samuel stood alone among the bodies, feeling neither satisfaction nor remorse. Justice had been served, but it was a cold and terrible form of justice that brought no joy. He could hear voices in the distance, house servants wondering about the unusual silence from the dining room. Soon someone would investigate and Samuel's role would be discovered, but he had never expected to survive this night. When the house guards finally broke down the dining room door, they found Samuel sitting quietly at the kitchen table, his life's blood pooling around the knife he had driven into his own heart. Beside him lay a carefully written confession, detailing every aspect of his plan and explaining the reasons behind his actions. The conspiracy of silence, the discovery of the massacre sent shockwaves through Charleston society that reverberated far beyond South Carolina. In a single night, Samuel had eliminated a significant portion of the state's leadership, creating a power vacuum that would take years to fill. But from the first moments after the bodies were discovered, a conspiracy of silence began to take shape. The white elite understood instinctively that the true story could never be told in its entirety. To acknowledge that an enslaved man had possessed the intelligence and skill to orchestrate such sophisticated revenge would challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which their entire society was built. The official story that emerged bore little resemblance to the truth. According According to the version published in Charleston's newspapers, Governor Moultrie and his guests had been killed by a deranged slave who had poisoned their food in a fit of sudden madness. Samuel was portrayed not as a calculating revolutionary, but as an unstable individual who had snapped under pressure. But controlling the official narrative proved easier than suppressing the truth entirely. Despite the conspiracy of silence maintained by Charleston's white elite, word of what had really happened spread through the enslaved community with remarkable speed and accuracy. Within weeks, enslaved people throughout the Carolinas and Georgia knew the real story of Samuel's revenge. New laws were enacted prohibiting enslaved people from gathering in groups larger than 5 without white supervision. Literacy restrictions were tightened, making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. Kitchen staffs at major plantations were restructured, with multiple enslaved cooks sharing responsibilities to prevent any single individual from having complete control over food preparation. Most significantly, a campaign of deliberate historical erasure began almost immediately. Samuel's confession was destroyed within days of its discovery. Official records were sealed or altered, removing any reference to the systematic nature of Samuel's planning or his justice-based motivations. Over the following decades, even the distorted official version began to fade from public memory. By the time of the Civil War, Samuel's story had been almost entirely erased from white historical consciousness, surviving only in the oral traditions maintained by enslaved communities. But the impact of Samuel's actions extended far beyond the immediate casualties. His demonstration that enslaved people possessed both the capability and motivation to strike back created a climate of fear and suspicion that fundamentally altered master-slave relationships throughout the South. Plantation owners who had previously felt secure in their absolute power began to view their enslaved workers with new wariness. Kitchen staffs, in particular, came under intense scrutiny. The intimate access that cooks had to their master's food was suddenly seen as a potential threat rather than a convenience. The underground legend, while Charleston's white elite worked to erase Samuel's story from official history, his legend took on a life of its own within the hidden networks of resistance that connected enslaved communities throughout the South. The oral tradition that preserved his story transformed Samuel from a historical figure into a folk hero, a symbol that justice might eventually triumph over oppression. Enslaved cooks throughout the South began to view their positions with new awareness of the power they wielded. While few possessed either the opportunity or determination to replicate Samuel's ultimate act of revenge, many found smaller ways to assert their resistance within the constraints of their bondage. The legend of Samuel also influenced the broader culture of resistance within enslaved communities. His story became part of a larger oral tradition that included tales of successful escapes and acts of sabotage. These stories served as both inspiration and instruction, providing models for resistance while reinforcing the understanding that slavery was a condition to be endured rather than accepted. Frederick Douglass sometimes referenced the Charleston cook in his speeches, though he was careful never to provide details that might endanger the enslaved people who had preserved Samuel's story. Harriet Tubman reportedly told potential escapees about the man who served justice at the master's table, using Samuel's story as an example of how enslaved people could find ways to resist even when escape seemed impossible. As the decades passed and tensions over slavery escalated, Samuel's legend evolved to meet the changing needs of the communities that preserved it. During the 1850s, his story was often told as a prophetic warning about what would happen if the injustices of slavery were not addressed through peaceful means. When Union forces finally occupied Charleston in 1865, bringing freedom to the thousands of enslaved people who had preserved Samuel's story through 3 generations of bondage, many saw his spirit in their liberation. The man who had died alone in Governor Moultrie's kitchen had somehow managed to strike the first blow in a war that would ultimately destroy the system that had claimed his life. Echoes across time. The legend of Samuel of Charleston did not die with the abolition of slavery. Instead, his story evolved to serve each new generation of African Americans who struggled against oppression in its various forms. During Jim Crow, when legal segregation sought to reestablish white supremacy, Samuel's story took on new relevance as proof that even the most powerful oppressors were vulnerable to resistance. The civil rights movement discovered in Samuel a predecessor whose tactical sophistication offered lessons for contemporary struggles. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., though publicly committed to nonviolent resistance, was reportedly fascinated by Samuel's story when he first heard it as a seminary student. Malcolm X was more openly admiring, referencing in several speeches an enslaved man who had served justice at the master's table. The Black Power movement embraced Samuel's story even more enthusiastically, seeing in his actions a model for the kind of decisive resistance they believed necessary to achieve true equality. Academic interest in African American history during the 1970s led several historians to attempt research into Samuel's story, though they discovered the extent to which official records had been destroyed or altered. Dr. Angela Davis devoted considerable attention to Samuel's story in her research on slave resistance. Samuel of Charleston understood something that many contemporary revolutionaries fail to grasp, Davis wrote. He recognized that the most effective resistance often comes from those who appear most compliant, who have gained the trust of their oppressors, who possess intimate knowledge of their enemies' vulnerabilities. By the 1990s, Samuel's story had become a staple of African American cultural expression, appearing in literature, music, and visual art. The advent of the internet brought new opportunities for preserving and disseminating his story as descendants, shared family histories, and oral traditions passed down through generations. In 2005, Charleston community activists established the Samuel Memorial Project, dedicated to researching his story and creating a permanent commemoration. The project faced considerable opposition from local historical societies and tourism boards, who argued that such a memorial would present an unbalanced view of Charleston's history. The controversy reflected broader tensions about how American history should be remembered and taught. The debate continues today as American society struggles to come to terms with the full complexity of its historical relationship with slavery and racism. Whether viewed as hero or villain, freedom fighter or terrorist, Samuel of Charleston represents something that cannot be ignored: the enduring human capacity to resist oppression, even at the ultimate cost, even when victory seems impossible, even when the only available weapon is knowledge carefully gathered and patiently applied in service of justice. His legacy lives on in every act of resistance against injustice, every moment when the oppressed refuse to accept their oppression as natural, every instance when those who appear powerless demonstrate that true power lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything in service of what is right. The feast is finished, but justice, like a perfectly prepared meal, may be delayed in its serving, but when it finally arrives, it satisfies in ways that sustain the soul. Long after the last dish has been consumed, Samuel's greatest victory was not the death of his enemies, but the immortality of his example. He had served the ultimate course at the table of history, and its effects continue to nourish the ongoing struggle for human dignity and freedom. The story reminds us that those who appear to serve may actually rule, that those who seem powerless may wield the ultimate power, and that justice, when it comes, often arrives wearing the mask of the very system it has come to destroy.